In this video, I'm going to explain how we can configure EIGRP authentication in classic mode and also in named mode configuration of EIGRP. Let me to show you the text file and the steps in this scenario. Step 1 is the draw the topology in EIGRP. I completed this step, and after that, step 2, interface IP address assignment and no shutdown command in router 1, router 2, router 3. Again, this is completed. And the step 3, first we should configure classic EIGRP in the router 1 and router 2, and you know that we configured it in the previous videos. And in step 4, we should configure named EIGRP in the router 3. Until now, we don't have any authentication. Finally, we should check the routing table in router 1, router 2, and router 3 and connectivity between R1 and R3. After that, we should configure EIGRP authentication between router 1 and router 2 because we configured router 1 and router 2 with classic EIGRP. Here we should configure the authentication in classic mode. And after that, here in the step 7, you can see that we should configure authentication between router 2 and router 3. And because router 3 uses the named EIGRP configuration, here we have a little difference in configuration of the authentication. Let me to show you. It is so easy. First, in the router 1, I want to configure the EIGRP without the authentication. Here enable and then configure terminal router EIGRP1 and then network address 10.1.2.1 quad 0, and after that network quad 1 quad 0. Okay, this is the configuration of router 1. In the router 2, again we need to use the classic mode, enable configure terminal router EIGRP1 and then network 10.1.2.2 quad 0, and after that network 10.2.3.2 quad 0. Now we have neighborship between the router 1 and router 2, as you can see. In the router 3, I want to use the named mode configuration, router EIGRP, for example, lab, address family, IPv4, unicast, autonomous system. Instead of the autonomous system, you can use only AS. Okay, AS1, and then network 10.2.3.3 quad 0, the first command, and after that network quad 3 quad 0. As you can see, now we have neighborship between router 3 and router 2. You know that here we configured router 3 with the named mode and router 2 with the classic mode, but they can neighbor with each other because the outgoing effect of the packets are same when you configure from which of these modes. All right, now we have connectivity between R1 and R2 and R3. Show IP route. EIGRP can show us that in R1 we have quad 3/32, this loopback, and also in the router 3, if you check, you will see that show IP route. Okay, show IP route can show us that we have the quad 1/32. What does it mean? It means that R1 and R3 can reach to each other. For example, in R1 you can use ping quad 3 with the source of loopback 0. We have connectivity. Okay, until now we didn't configure any new feature. All of these features were learned in the previous video. Now I'm going to explain how you can configure authentication. You will have this configuration in the text file, but I want to configure first. EIGRP only support the MD5 authentication with keychain. You need to first configure the keychain. The syntax is keychain. You should give it a name, R1 key, for example. And after that, here we can configure multiple keys. Let me to use the key ID 1, key 1. This is the key 1, and the key string or the password is Cisco, for example, or any other key. This is the key, our keychain. Also, you can use show keychain for monitoring this keychain. Our keychain name is R1 key, and key 1 text is Cisco. Also, here we have some options for configuring accept lifetime, send lifetime, and so on, other things. Okay, and then we can use this keychain in EIGRP or in some other features. For example, how we can enable the authentication in EIGRP classic configuration. You should configure this keychain on the interface that you want to use this keychain on that interface for authentication. For example, as you can see, now we are configuring the keychain for authenticating R1 and R2 over the serial 10. Because of that, we should go to the serial 10, and here you need to configure two commands. First, IP authentication mode for EIGRP1 is MD5. This is the only mode that in classic mode that we have. We don't have any other mode, but we should configure it. IP authentication mode EIGRP1 MD5, and after that IP authentication actually keychain for EIGRP1 is the name of keychain R1 key. As you can see, now the neighborship is interrupted. Why? Because actually neighborship is down. Why? Because here needs authentication, but in R2 we didn't configure authentication. Here show IP EIGRP neighbors can show us that we don't have neighborship with the router 2. This is the configuration, show run interface serial 10. As you can see, IP authentication mode for EIGRP1 MD5, IP authentication keychain for EIGRP1 R1 key. Then let me to configure the keychain in the router 2. Don't forget, you can configure any name for the keychain. The keychain name is local, and it's not important to configure same keychain name between router 1 and router 2. Let me to configure, for example, keychain R2 key. And as you can see here, we have different keychain name. Key ID is 1. Key ID is important. Key string also is important. Key string is, for example, Cisco. And after that, interface serial 10. And here you should first configure IP authentication mode for EIGRP1 MD5 and IP authentication keychain for EIGRP1 again R2 key. Okay, now the neighborship will establish again between R1 and R2 after some second. And here you can see do show IP EIGRP neighbors that we have neighborship with the router 1 with authentication, but with router 3 without authentication. Why? Because we enabled the keychain or authentication on the serial 10, not serial 11 in the router 2. Also here, if you check show IP EIGRP interface detail, for example, serial 10, this command, you can see that here we are using the authentication mode is MD5, keychain is R2 key. Okay, but if you check show IP EIGRP interface detail serial 11, here we don't have any authentication. Look at here, authentication mode is not set. Let me to configure authentication on the serial 11 also. Interface serial 11, you can use this keychain or any other keychain. Let me to use the same keychain. IP authentication mode for EIGRP1 is MD5, and IP authentication keychain for EIGRP1 is the R2 key. Okay, again the neighborship will be down, and after that we need to configure the authentication in the router 3. Don't forget here, because we have hold time, and hold time by default is 15 seconds in EIGRP. After 15 seconds the neighborship between the router 2 and router 3 will down. Okay, and do show IP EIGRP neighbors can show us that here now we have this actually in the router 3 show IP EIGRP neighbors, and now we have neighborship. Let me to check it again in their do show run interface serial 10. We have authentication serial 11. Okay, we didn't configure. I configured it on the serial 110 again. Let me to configure it on the serial 11. IP authentication mode is for example for EIGRP1 is MD5. IP authentication actually a keychain for EIGRP1 is the R2 key. Neighborship is down now, and after that here in the router 3, let me to show you again, show IP EIGRP neighbors, we don't have neighborship. In the router 3, again, we need to configure the keychain. About the configuration of keychain here, we don't have any difference. For example, R3 key, this is the keychain of the router 3, key ID is 1, and a key string is Cisco. But because here we have named EIGRP, let me to show you, this is the do show run. Okay, here do show run can show us that we configured the named EIGRP. Okay, here you should go to the router EIGRP lab, and then under the address family IPv4 unicast or AS number 1, you should go to the AF interface serial 10. Actually, you should configure the authentication here, not on the interface itself. AF interface serial 10 means all of the EIGRP lab configuration, okay, related to the EIGRP to on the serial 10. And here you can configure again authentication mode. In the named mode configuration, you have two methods of authentication, MD5 and HMAC SHA 256. Here we should use MD5. Authentication mode is MD5, and also authentication keychain is R3 keychain. Okay, R3 key actually. Now we will have neighborship between the router 2 and router 3 also. Show IP EIGRP neighbors. Also show EIGRP IPv4. Show EIGRP address family, okay, interface for IPv4, then interface, for example, detail serial 10 can show us that we have authentication mode of MD5 and keychain is R3 key. So easy. And in the R1, again, show IP route can show us that we have connectivity to the quad 3, the loopback of router 3, ping, a quad 3 source loopback 0. Because of that, now we can configure EIGRP authentication for both classic configuration and also the named configuration. Here in the text file also you have this configuration, keychain name, key ID, and then key string, string. On the classic mode, you need to configure the authentication under the serial, under the actual interface mode, IP authentication mode, EIGRP AS number MD5, IP authentication keychain, EIGRP AS number, then the name of keychain. But under the named configuration, you should go to the interface here. Let me to add it here, router config, then router config, router AF. Okay, here the command is the AF interface. Here you have two options, the name of interface or default. If you use the name of interface, actually you configure some features related to exactly that interface. But if you use default, okay, means all interfaces. Okay, actually this will be default, AF interface default, or the name of interface here in the router 3 configure terminal, router EIGRP lab, and then address family IPv4 unicast AS1. AF interface give us two options. First, the name of interface and also the default option. All right, don't forget, if you use the in both sites, for example, named EIGRP, you can configure SHA 256. Let me to show you. For example, in the router 2, let me to remove the EIGRP we configured before, because here I can't configure the because router 2 uses the classic configuration. We can't use SHA 256. In the router 2, I want to remove the EIGRP configuration or classic configuration, no router EIGRP1. Let me to configure named mode, router EIGRP lab, address family IPv4 unicast, and then for example AS1, and then network 10.1.2.2 quad 0, okay, and then network 10.2.3.2 quad 0. That's it. And after that, I want to enable the authentication with the router 1 with MD5 mode, AF interface serial 10. Authentication mode is MD5, and authentication keychain, as you know, is the R2 key. Okay, here now we won't have any problem. But about the next, let me to go to the next interface. In AF interface serial 11, I want to use the SHA 256. Here we have a little difference. Authentication mode is HMAC SHA 256. This is more stronger method, and here you can configure the key here. You don't need to configure the keychain. Authentication mode HMAC SHA 256, and then directly the password, for example Cisco. That's it. And also we should configure this in the router 3. In the router 3, now we are under the address family. Let me to go to AF interface serial 10 mode. Here you should configure authentication mode SHA HMAC SHA 256, and then for example Cisco, and this is the configuration that we need here. Do show run can show us under the EIGRP. We have this configuration. Let me to also remove the authentication keychain command. No authentication keychain R3 key. This is our configuration now. Do show run a section router EIGRP. Okay, as you can see here, now we have this EIGRP configuration, authentication mode, HMAC SHA 256. And then in the router one, let me to check everything. Show IP EIGRP neighbors. We have neighborship with router actually 2. In router 2, we have neighborship show IP EIGRP neighbors. We have neighborship with both router 1 and router 3. And also here in the router 3, you can use show IP EIGRP neighbors or show EIGRP address family IPv4 neighbors, for example. Again, we have neighborship with the router 2. Let me to show you in router 2, show IP EIGRP interface detail serial 10. Here we are using authentication mode is MD5, keychain is R2 key, and show IP EIGRP neighbor serial 11 can show us that authentication mode is HMAC SHA 256 and keychain is not set. This is the authentication in the EIGRP. We experienced two methods. In the classic mode, we have only MD5, but in the name configuration, the newer method of configuration, we have both MD5 and also the SHA 256, and SH 256 is a little more stronger than MD5.